ornate coffin, or a black and white portrait of an elderly, stern Queen Victoria. Eerie, suspenseful, everyone knows the story of the monarch who defined an age, the stern, black-clad widow who ruled an empire from her throne of grief. But what if the most fascinating chapter of Queen Victoria's story wasn't the life she lived in public view, but the one she meticulously planned for in absolute secrecy? Her coffin was not just a final resting place, it was a vault, a time capsule of forbidden sentiment, private devotion, and stunning defiance, assembled under the very noses of the royal family who thought they knew her. For over a century, the full truth was locked away, hidden by royal decree and the loyalty of a single, devoted man. This is the story of the love tokens she smuggled into eternity, of a second wedding ring from a scandalous companion, of a funeral in white, and a final, breathtaking act of rebellion against her own heirs. You know the legend. This is the untold truth of Victoria's coffin. But before we begin, like and subscribe. Queen Victoria dominated the greater part of the 19th century. Upon her death at the age of 81, the Queen provided covert, meticulous directions concerning the treatment of her remains and the specific objects to be interred with her. And since royalty seldom encounters refusal, several of these objects were profoundly strange. So today we are thoroughly exploring all the peculiar items placed in Queen Victoria's coffin. Not an actual physical exploration, mind you. That is the Queen of England. Now then, who is prepared for history's most morbid scavenger hunt? When she died, Queen Victoria was Britain's monarch with the longest reign. Her existence was filled with duty, affection, and mystery. Yet her 9 children frequently expressed fierce disagreement with certain aspects of Victoria's lifestyle and held bitterness toward those to whom she was most devoted. Therefore, when the moment arrived for the Queen to prepare her final plans, she understood her desires would need a degree of confidentiality to be properly fulfilled, particularly the items Queen Victoria intended to take to her grave. Near her life's end, Victoria called for her secretary, who also served as her principal lady-in-waiting, and articulated 12 pages of precise orders about her funeral and interment. The lady-in-waiting personally delivered these instructions to the Queen's doctor, Sir James Reed, as recounted by writer Tony Rennell. A descendant of the Reed family, authored a volume concerning the physician and his career. However, the details of the confidential orders were prohibited by the Royal College censors. When the Reed family invited Rennell to examine their records, he discovered the concealed directives composed just prior to Victoria's passing. He managed to publish his investigations successfully, and for the first time, Victoria's ultimate wishes were revealed. Consequently, it was her physician who executed all her requests. He was the sole individual who knew the precise circumstances of Queen Victoria's death. He cared for her continuously during her final days, and his was the name she uttered with her last breath. And he carried out every one of her stipulations, regardless of how odd they were. Among the initial unusual entries on Victoria's list was a plaster casting of Prince Albert's hand, created soon after he died. When her spouse Albert passed away suddenly at 42, Victoria was shattered. Her manner of coping with his absence provided great inspiration to bereaved individuals throughout the Western world. For instance, she is largely the reason we connect the color black with a state of mourning. But the Queen proceeded somewhat further. For many years after his death, she had Albert's former staff perform his morning routines. Servants delivered hot water, his shaving brush and mug, and towels to his room each morning. His valet also continued to present the outfit he would have worn that day. Each evening, the servants would come back and clear the articles away, only to repeat the process the following day and the day after that. Similar to a British reinterpretation of The Sixth Sense, Victoria maintained her bedroom hung with black and adorned with Albert's likeness in photographs and paintings. She slept each night with a plaster cast of his hand, rather like a teddy bear from a Tim Burton film. She likely decided it was only appropriate that she rest with it forever. In a grim fusion of death and beginning, Queen Victoria's secret orders required her entire funeral, from the horses to the mourning clothes, to be dressed in white. She also demanded to be buried wearing the white bridal veil from her 1840 marriage to Prince Albert. Look, she was truly devoted to that man. In fact, it was the young monarch Victoria who disrupted prior conventions and started the practice of wearing completely white wedding dresses. Her selection stemmed partly from a wish to represent her innocence, as both she and Albert were untested in matters of love on their wedding night. Nowadays, nearly every bridal gown is white. In the end, perhaps Victoria returned to her white bridal veil as an emblem of the most joyful bond in her life and of her aspiration to reunite with Albert in the afterlife, where she might also get to spend time with Jimi Hendrix. This is where Victoria's instructions for her coffin's contents grew somewhat intricate. While her family was aware she requested burial wearing her wedding ring, only the Queen's secretary and physician knew she wished to be buried wearing an additional wedding ring on her left ring finger. This ring was presented to her by a man other than her husband, a man she grew to know intimately during the 4 decades she lived after Albert's passing. Victoria's connection with the Scottish attendant John Brown was immensely contentious, especially among the British royal family. She had summoned him during the initial period of her widowhood, recalling that Prince Albert had held Brown in very high regard. The Queen and the gillie, a Gaelic word for a servant, formed a strong friendship. He stood as the sole person within Victoria's circle who could criticize her without consequence and address her with informal familiarity. Author Tony Ronell revealed the account of the second wedding band, and more lately, historian A.N. Wilson has contended that Victoria and Brown certainly shared a romantic attachment, though it was never physically fulfilled. According to Wilson, they shared a bed but only embraced one another. Sure, whatever you say, buddy. Wilson also references a deathbed admission from a Scottish minister who asserted he had privately wedded the pair. Regardless of their precise relationship or marital standing, the Queen's children completely detested Brown and remained furious with their mother for the remainder of her days, even following Brown's own death. So intense was the anger of Victoria's son and successor, King Edward VII, that once his mother was securely in the ground, he ordered the removal or destruction of every monument and reference to John Brown across all royal estates. What the new monarch did not realize was that his mother had been interred while holding her cherished photograph and a lock of hair from her dear John Brown, and while wearing the wedding ring belonging to Brown's mother upon her finger. So, who's going to break the news to him? Queen Victoria was buried amidst an ocean of sentimental keepsakes and an assortment of blossoms. Her daughter-in-law, Alexandra of Denmark, brought fresh hyacinths to the coffin before its sealing, and Victoria's physician and confidant, Sir James Reed, utilized the new Queen Alexandra's floral present as a method to conceal the secret objects held within Victoria's left hand. Foremost among the floral tributes was a petition made by the Queen herself. She requested that a spray of heather be positioned upon her person as it was prepared for burial. The blooming heather is a Scottish emblem and likely served as a memento of joyful periods with her family at Balmoral Castle, alongside the spirited times she enjoyed with her Scottish servant and companion, John Brown. Queen Victoria was interred within the elaborate mausoleum she had constructed years before to contain the remains of her adored Albert. At his passing, she commissioned a life-size sculpture of Albert at rest, his head tilted toward a statue of his wife, which was positioned atop his sarcophagus. Her own corresponding effigy was placed in storage to be installed upon her eventual death. Victoria in marble repose appears precisely as she envisioned herself, even at the end, youthful and enamored, akin to that Bryan Adams melody. However, when she died 4 decades after Albert, everyone had forgotten where her grave statue was stored, which surely created an awkward situation. Thus, the Queen was initially buried without the statue, and it was several months before it was discovered, boarded up behind a wall at Windsor Castle. Queen Victoria's post-mortem directives were so thorough that she even specified exactly whom she desired to lift her body into its ultimate resting place. Once her doctor and secretary positioned the majority of the sentimental articles into the coffin, select family members and servants were assembled to transfer her body from bed to casket. Lifting at her head were the physician and the chief lady-in-waiting. Lifting along one side of her form were her son and heir, the new King Edward VII, her grandson, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, and another of her sons, Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, and Strathearn. Lifting on the opposite side of her body were 3 of her most dedicated servants. The coffin was already almost full with the sentimental items Victoria wished to keep beside her in death. Yet her small frame, a mere 5 feet tall, was lowered into her assembled treasures with space remaining. It was at this juncture that her ladies gathered closely, aided by the doctor to make any final adjustments and introduce a few last secret objects. Her attending relatives then departed the room, which permitted Reed to place the wedding band belonging to John Brown's mother upon the Queen's left ring finger, and to slip the photograph and lock of hair from her Scottish companion into the same hand. The casket was then sealed permanently. Victoria's secret indeed. Sir James Reed acted as Queen Victoria's principal doctor for the final 15 years of her life. He was dedicated to her, and she to him, trusting no one among her family with her ultimate wishes. It was only logical for her to depend on him as the guardian of her life's confidential matters. The detailed instructions composed by the Queen's secretary still survive. They remain in the possession of Reed's descendants as part of his assemblage of private documents, and the royal family is not pleased about this. Elegant push-in on the sealed doors of the royal mausoleum at Frogmore. The refined, suspenseful music from the intro returns, now with a more resolved yet within that ornate casket, surrounded by white satin and the scent of hyacinth. Queen Victoria finally achieved the privacy she had craved. Her public life, a monument to empire and duty, was complete. But her private farewell, that was her own masterpiece, a final act of sovereignty not over nations but over her own memory. She orchestrated a secret narrative to be buried alongside her, a collection of truths and tokens too potent, too personal for the living world to hold. Across the Windsor Castle archives, then, to a close-up of an old, handwritten document, the doctor she trusted fulfilled his oath. The family who resented her remained for decades blissfully unaware. And those 12 pages of secret instructions, they didn't disappear. They survive, not in a royal vault, but in the private possession of a descendant's family, a lasting whisper of a queen's last will, still guarded from the crown that tried to silence it. Which makes you wonder, in the silent dark of that mausoleum, what other untold truths are still waiting? What stories did other monarchs, presidents, or icons take with them, sealed away by loyalty, sealed away by fear. What hidden farewell should we uncover next? Tell us in the comments.